I'm so happy to be once again joined by Sally Helgesen, which is cited in Forbes as the world's premier expert on women leadership and as an internationally best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach. Sally's latest best-selling book, Rising Together: How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a More Inclusive Workplace, offers practical ways to build more inclusive relationships, teams, and workplaces. And that's going to be the focus of today's episode. And this book really builds on Sally's remarkable success with How Women Rise, co-authored by legendary executive coach Marshall Goldsmith, which examined the behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women as they move forward in their careers. And this was the topic of our previous episode. But thank you again, Sally, for joining me on the Good Leadership Podcast.
Oh, Charles, it's always a wonderful pleasure to talk to you.
Great. Well, I'd just like to start out with really what inspired you to write this new book, Rising Together?
Well, it was very specific, kind of an aha moment. I had been asked to deliver a women's leadership workshop at the Construction Super Conference in Las Vegas. This was in the fall of 2019 before things shut down. And there were about 6,000 men there and maybe 400 women at the conference. And so I asked the planners, what should I expect? And they said, well, based on what happened last year, you can expect between 75 and 100 women in your breakout, and they'll be looking for ways they can boost their careers. So I thought, well, that falls into my sweet spot. So I went down to the room, and there were about 300 people there. And I would say 70% of them were men. I could not have been more surprised. Of course, what I prepared didn't exactly work for this very different audience. So I asked people there why they had come. So interested, I was fascinated why that many men had shown up at a women's leadership workshop. And I heard things that, of course, weren't surprising. Men said, we've got to get better at hiring, attracting, retaining talented women. That's important key to our survival. And we're hoping you can help with that. But then one executive stood up and he was very blunt and he said, we hope that you are not going to waste your time telling us why we need to get better at this. We get it. We understand. We just don't know how to do it. We don't have a clue. So I thought, there's that word how again. We'd had such success with How Women Rise because it was so focused on a tactical approach that people could take. So I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a book about the how of not just getting better with hiring, attracting, and retaining women, but diverse employees of all kinds. This is a global issue. Companies everywhere are struggling with it, but they don't have a tactical guide for how to do it or how to address the problems that arise. It's all why you should do it. So that's what I'm going to do. So I left that event knowing that that would be the next book that I would write.
That's wonderful. And I really enjoyed reading the book. And you're right. The need to create cultures of belonging is more urgent now than ever, given the unprecedented willingness of people just to walk away from workplaces in which they feel undervalued, disconnected, or burnt out. And you referenced in the book about the Gallup State of the Global Workplace study back in 2019, but the most recent one just came out a few months ago. You quote that in the book, 15% of employees reported feeling actively engaged. Well, this has got even worse since that study, and the latest report kind of validates that. Are you finding that as well through your work and with the organizations that you're working with?
I find them really struggling with that. It's epitomized by the whole return to work. Okay, you can do hybrid work. Companies are very intent on getting people back into the workplace and in providing ultimatums about dates. And then they blow through the dates and people aren't doing it. So then they set a new date and they lose credibility in setting new dates. And really, the question that organizations need to ask is, how can we help you be most productive? Because people are smart, they understand. And a lot of people feel that they have been more productive. in a primarily virtual workplace. So, how are we going to balance that? How are we going to give people a situation in which they can be productive, really contribute, form relationships that are important, and that can be harder in the virtual world, but also, lay the groundwork for real collaboration, creativity, great ideas, and insights? That's the question that companies need to ask, not when do we demand everybody return? I've got clients all around the world. I've been doing the work I've been doing for 35 years. So I have had a lot of contact with people. I hear clients all over the world say some version of this. We are very committed to diversity. We understand it is to, really getting good at engaging a diverse workforce. And this isn't just in the US, not at all. This is everywhere. So we rolled out a huge unconscious bias initiative to our people, everybody above a certain level. We did this worldwide. It was a huge initiative. They said a lot of people, felt they benefited from it, but we noticed no change. Now, I'm very oriented toward behaviors, as anybody who's read How Women Rise knows. These are behaviors that internal barriers that get in people's way. And focusing on unconscious bias doesn't really provide any path forward. Sometimes it's very effective. Sometimes people have great insights, and I've certainly heard that. Sometimes it's not very effective, and people can feel more excluded than they felt before when they hear prompted individuals who they work with say how they really feel about people like them. Certainly heard that. So it can cut both ways, but even when it's effective, it doesn't give a path forward. This is why this executive was so frustrated about the how. What are the tactical behaviors? What behaviors do other people perceive as inclusive? Because what matters to people is how you act, not how you think. And how we think is basically nobody's business. We have a right to the thoughts that go on in our own mind. And people can be resentful about saying, okay, now we're going to change your thoughts. It's easier also to act our way into new ways of thinking than to think our way into new ways of acting. That's just how we as humans function. We behave in a new way, we get a different response, and then we begin to feel differently, say, about the person that we get that response from. So that's a much more effective path than trying to change how we think first and then assuming that that's going to impact how we act.
So I love that response, Sally. And in other words, changing our actions is more likely to change our thoughts than changing our thoughts is to change our actions, which is counterintuitive for a lot of people.
It's true, but when you think about how it works, say, for example, you think you don't like a certain person. And then you behave a little differently to them. You say something, you give them a compliment. You don't let what you're really thinking necessarily show. And you get a response from them that's very positive. That has the ability to create a new basis for a relationship. And you may end up thinking, you know what? I really like that person. And you may end up then changing your view of what you might consider people like them. So it's a very important thing for getting comfortable with people who we assume that we won't have that much in common with, or who we worry that we might say the wrong thing to, whatever. Those are very abstract or theoretical concerns. Whereas if we can form some kind of relationship with them through our behaviors, through practicing inclusion, it's much likely to be more successful.
Definitely agree with that statement. And you propose a positive and action based approach, one that enables everyone to live with a new way of thinking rather than attempting to think our way into a new way of being. And that first part of your book, which I love, is 8 common triggers that are most likely to undermine our ability to collaborate across these divides. not only with gender, but also with age, ethnicity, race, and life experience. And these triggers are widespread, yet they're rarely acknowledged. If you could just kind of give us a broad overview of, what you mean by triggers, and then perhaps we can go into a few of those just to unpack them in a little more detail.
Certainly. Triggers are basically situations, people, events that stir an emotional response in us. So we can't really control what triggers us because we cannot control our environment. My colleague Marshall Goldsmith said, our environment is a nonstop triggering machine. It is always evoking responses in us. So once we accept that we can't really control that environment, then we have to think, how can we respond to what triggers us in a more effective way? What the book really does in Rising Together, I try to look at the most common triggers, that is, events, situations, comments, etc., that can undermine our ability to create strong relationships with people we perceive as different from ourselves, and ways to address them, specific ways to address them. So that's the context for the first part of the book where we're looking at triggers. And this is important because triggers are what are more like most likely to get in the way of our demonstrating inclusive behaviors. We can read about inclusive behaviors all day long. And the second half of the book, I talk about quite a number of them in very specific terms. But if our emotions are getting in the way and we think, well, I don't really want to do that, or this situation is so unfair, why should I, et cetera, then that's going to hold us back from being able to practice that. So that's why I felt that these triggers, these stumbling blocks, are the first thing we want to address.
And you're right; these triggers kick off these emotional reactions, and that leads us to having these default stories that rely on generalizations and stereotypes. And you really push forward that devising a positive story to explain these triggering events is simple and a very effective tool to use.
I think this is the tool in the book that I most want to see become socialized in organizations. And that is the whole concept of rewriting a script when we feel triggered. Let me give an example of how that works. The first trigger in the book is visibility. This is a very common trigger. If we feel that we're not good at bringing notice to our contributions, to our good work, we can be triggered by people who are very good at it. We think, oh, he's such a showboat. He's always talking about himself. I'm not that kind of person. That can be our internal script in response. But conversely, people who are very good at bringing notice, people who are very good at visibility, can be triggered by people who aren't very good. Well, she's, content to sit in the back of the room and say nothing. So clearly she's not a player. Can dismiss people who could make extraordinary contributions based on their not being that comfortable with visibility. So rather than trying in some way to address the trigger of visibility, the best thing we can do in that situation is to experiment with a script that tells ourselves a different story. The person who is very good at visibility, who may reframe an idea, for example, that we broached in a meeting and start talking about it without necessarily giving us credit. We're telling ourselves, trying to steal my idea. Or, this is typical. People listen to him, they don't listen to me. So, this is a kind of story. It may be true, it may not be true. We don't have all the information. But whether it is true or not, it does not serve our interests because it doesn't give us any kind of path to action or any way to engage that person who has triggered us as a potential ally. If we can simply rewrite that script, hmm, okay, he reframed the idea that I brought up in a meeting. Maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he's just confirming that he thinks it's a great idea and he assumes everybody recognizes that I was the first one who said it. Whatever story we tell ourselves, it just enables us to take a positive action. In this case, for example, after the meeting, go up to that person, or if it's a virtual meeting, email that person. I was so glad to see that you affirmed the idea that I brought up and ran with it. I think this might be something that we could collaborate on, push forward in the organization. Love to talk with you about how we might have a bigger impact with this idea. Now, when I recommend something like this, say this specific situation, somebody will usually say, but I do think he was trying to steal my idea. So what? Knowing that, what path to action do you have? Go up and accuse him of trying to steal your idea? Complain to HR? No. What most people do in that situation is they start complaining to their friends, or people they know who are in the meeting. Oh, did you see what that guy did? That's so typical. That's what he always does. This is a powerless way to behave in the world. So, what we want to do is if we can reframe it positively, then we give ourselves a way to move forward. And that's what really matters. Here's the thing, it's not important whether you believe your new script or not. It just gives you a path to action that might work or might not. But the other thing will keep you stuck.
Completely agree. And the ideal moment is really to recognize that fact, to pause and to tweak your internal dialogue in the moment when you see you're being triggered so you can question your usual story. And like you said, write a more positive script. You give a great story in the book about Colonel Diane Ryan. She had a stellar career in the army, but she struggled throughout her years of service and having her presence acknowledged in the most basic way, correct?
That's exactly right. Diane would have this situation. She was at West Point. She'd been, in the Defense Department in DC. She was, I think, did 3 tours in Iraq and was one of the first women who ever led a platoon there. Maybe it wasn't a platoon, maybe it was a smaller unit. So Diane said that what would happen to her constantly once she achieved officer status is she would pass by a more junior person, a guy, and he would not salute her. He would either look at something else or would just put his eyes straight ahead or he'd just nod like that, but he wouldn't salute her. Now, this is a practice throughout the Army that is very important, that you salute and you acknowledge a senior officer. She'd see them do it to male senior officers. She felt that she knew that generally this happened, and it happened all the time, because they did not want to acknowledge that a woman could be in a senior position. So by passing her by, they were spared that acknowledgement. She knew she had to hold them to account, but she also knew that she had to do this in a positive way. She couldn't get into a scrap every time it happened because it happened all the time. And she didn't want to go complaining to somebody else because that would be ineffective. So, what she did was and this is the simplest kind of tweak, and you're right, making it a habit is great. Simplest kind of tweak that every time that happened, she would tell herself, I guess he didn't see me. So she would say, I think you didn't see me. And then they'd always go, oh, I didn't see you, and then they salute. So she gave them a way out. She said she didn't really believe it in most cases. She said occasionally, probably they didn't see me. I don't know. We're not inside someone else's head. She said, but it didn't do anything for me to believe that I knew they were doing this out of disrespect. I needed to make them respect me. I could not let it pass, but I had to do it in a way that gave them, as I put it throughout the book, she needed to give them the benefit of her goodwill, even if she was not convinced that they had earned it.
And that's a game changer. Being able to have that positive script, like you said, whether or not you believe it or you feel that it's authentic, it will make a significant difference and move you in the right direction moving forward. Let's move to another trigger, and the next one is managing perceptions, and it revolves around how can I represent my achievements, claim credit for my successes, without anyone thinking I'm self-centered, I'm aggressive, I'm too ambitious, and the truth is that you don't really hear that from the dominant group. You hear that a lot from women, from minorities that have likely been criticized in the past for behaviors that unfortunately are routinely accepted from males in the dominant group.
Yes, and this happens all the time. Women have said this to me for 35 years, but I've certainly heard it constantly from people of color, and I hear it from people who are not in the dominant group. If I'm working in Japan, I hear it from people of Korean origin. So it's just a very common thing that there's a lack of acceptance in the dominant group often of people behaving with any degree of assertion who are not what they see as people like them. That is, in the United States or Europe, that would be, white men of a certain background, but it's different all over the world. So that's why I call it the dominant group. It's not about white men, it's about the dominant group. Whoever is the dominant group feels, oh, ugh, that person's being a little assertive here. They're being aggressive. Here's what's important. I have seen women and people of color spend an enormous amount of energy, emotional energy, and mental intellectual energy trying to figure out how not to be perceived in that way. How can I get my point across, but make sure nobody in the room sees me as too aggressive or, trying to steal someone else's thunder? Guess what? You can't. You cannot make sure that no one in the room sees you that way because you cannot control their thoughts. Those lie outside your circle of control. What you don't want to do is spend so much energy trying to manage what people think, their perceptions, that you don't invest energy in trying to make your point as clearly, as strongly, as succinctly, and concisely as possible in order to maximize the likelihood that you will be heard. So you're putting your attention to the wrong thing. Also, I think I may have even made this point when we were talking about how women rise. When we get involved in managing people's perceptions, we forget the fact that people change their mind all the time. And I always use that story that happened to me about a boss I had when I worked in corporate communications. This is back in the 80s. And I went to a meeting. I was the only woman. I was the most junior person there. And I had an idea and I shared it. And afterwards, my boss's boss came up behind me and he said, "Well, you're certainly not afraid to tell us what you think," in the most scathing and dismissive way. And I thought, okay, I'm done here. My career is over, but what can I do? What was amazing is I did not say to him, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Was I out of turn?" But I wasn't defensive either. I didn't say, "Well, I have a perfect right to speak my mind." I thought it was a good idea. I just said, "No, I'm not." That's all. Not defensively. "No, I'm not." And what was interesting, and he sort of walked away, offended. But what was interesting was about 2 months later, I was passing by an office, and that same man was in there with a colleague of ours. And I heard him say, he didn't know I was anywhere nearby. I heard him say, "You know what I like about Sally is she's not afraid to say what she thinks." In other words, 2 months had passed. He'd seen me in other situations. And he not only gotten used to it, but something that he once thought was really out of line, he came to value. So this is important to keep in mind when we are managing people's perceptions as they get to know our style. If we are not defensive and we are not apologetic, they will probably get comfortable with whatever it is that makes them uncomfortable. And if they don't, if they're that dug into their own bias, there's very little we can do.
That's a great story illustrating that point, and you're right. Over time, those perceptions do change. So, in building an inclusive culture, there's always this tension between confidence and competence. We rise together by distinguishing overconfidence from competence, but yet they're hard to kind of separate. You give a great story in the book about Alan Mulally and how he did that when he first arrived at Ford.
It was fascinating. When Alan Mulally first arrived at Ford, he came there from Boeing, where he had basically spent his career. His entire career had been in the world of aerospace. Uh, and he was hired by Bill Ford to be the CEO of Ford based on the way in which he had influenced Boeing's culture at that time when he was there in a very senior position. And so he came to his first meeting, and it was with what they always called at Ford, where I'd done a lot of work in the past, the generals and the colonels, the most senior men there at that time. And there was probably a woman or two. But he came to that first meeting and he knew he was going to be tested. And sure enough, at some point, one of his direct reports stood up and asked him a very complicated question about a new model that was coming out that Ford was putting a lot behind. And it was a question that someone who hadn't been in the car business for a long time would struggle to answer. So, what Alan did was very simple. He said, I have spent my entire career in aerospace. I am not a car guy. I was not hired as CEO here because I am a car guy. I was hired because of the kind of leadership model that Bill Ford is looking to instill in this culture that has been losing money significantly. He said, there are dozens of people in this company. He said, there are probably quite a number of people in this room who can answer that question. That question is not my job. I don't have the competence to answer that. So this was quite something. I have rarely seen someone in a very senior position like that basically say, I don't know. It's not my job to know everything. That's what Alan did. So he was able to demonstrate a certain humility, but it was also that he had a tremendous confidence in the competencies that he did have, which were different than what he was being asked about. Now, what's been fascinating is when I have told the story, which is basically a story about humility and not feeling like you have all the answers. Alan never apologized. He said, well, I'm sorry, no, never, absolutely never. He just stated the truth. When I tell this story, the women or people of color who are in the room always say, well, that would work for a white man. That would not work for me. My competence in every direction would be questioned. And so it's really important to be able to distinguish those, to identify and be able to articulate what our areas of real competence, to have confidence in that, but confidence that is rooted in our competencies. There's a wonderful book called The Confidence Code that was written for women, I think about 7, 10 years ago. But ever since then, there's been this idea that women and anybody who comes from the non-dominant group needs to be entirely confident in themselves and all their abilities in order to rise. By this model, confidence gets kind of untethered from competence. Now, the other side of that is we have seen certainly male CEOs who are the exact opposite of competent, yet seem to have tremendous confidence in their own ability to do basically everything. The opposite of how Alan Mulally presented himself. We see this, we've seen it for decades. Hundreds of billions of dollars in shareholder value have been lost because of overconfident leaders, CEOs, and leaders in general. So that's not the direction we want to go. We want to tie our confidence to our competence, but we want to understand that being overconfident, even if it's working for some people, is always going to be a bad idea.
Well, you're right. And it's worth noting that with Alan, his confidence was firmly rooted in his competence. The skills that he had acquired, he had cultivated, he had demonstrated and honed over years, decades of experience. And true confidence is always rooted in our sense of our own abilities, along with our capacity, our willingness to learn. And confidence ungrounded in actual competence, well, that risks exposing us to one of those two extremes that you mentioned, delusional sense of your own greatness or the imposter syndrome with its fear of exposure, right?
That's exactly right. You sound like you're quoting from Rising Together. So that's exactly what it does. The overconfidence, unless we're a delusional person, and there are many delusional people in leadership. We've seen them. Had that experience. Unless we're delusional, that over trying to demonstrate confidence when we're not sure, when we don't tie it to our own competencies. That's a primary reason that people feel the imposter syndrome. They feel that they have to present as if they are confident about things they're not necessarily confident about. So, this is not a comfortable place to be. And it's kind of a recipe for feeling inauthentic and feeling uncomfortable in the workplace.
That's great. And I wanted to try to touch upon one more trigger, and this is probably the most common everyday trigger, and that's in communication. And you kind of contrast that between men and women, right? Women's attention often operates like radar, scanning the environment and picking up a wide range of clues. But by contrast, men's attention operates more like a laser focused radar, blocking out whatever seems extraneous. Perhaps you could just give us more understanding around, how those differences in the way we look and perceive things could really impact the culture that we're trying to create.
Certainly, that's true. The how we connect the dots is our story. And that's where rewriting the script comes in so handy because the story we tell ourselves based upon what we notice may or may not reflect the entire situation. It may or may not accurately reflect who they really are. So we want to be able to question our own story. We want to be flexible and fluid in how we connect the dots. How we connect the dots, as you know, is based upon what we notice and what we value about what we notice. It's been very important for me in my work with women's leadership to understand the differences, and this is a generalization, of course, you can't say all women, all men, but the differences in general in how women notice and how men notice. That idea of the radar, taking in a lot of information. This is interesting. The sales numbers that I'm seeing are adding up. That person in the back room looks very distracted and disengaged. I wonder what's going on with him or her. So that sort of radar is operating, and you're looking at a lot of things that are going on at once in the room. And indeed, functional MRIs show that women's brains tend to light up in a lot of areas when they're focused on something, whereas men's brains tend to be much more narrowly focused and light up in one specific area. So men are more focused often in their notice. So what women can do there is say they dismiss men's very focused, let's get to the point, let's get to the bottom line. They dismiss that as, oh, he's pretty clueless. He doesn't really understand what's happening here. Men will dismiss women's radar and noticing a lot of what's going on. She seems to be all over the map. I can't follow her. She's got one idea here and one idea there. This is a very, very common story we tell ourselves. An awareness that those differences are often, not always, but often in effect, can help us rewrite our script in a really powerful way. Hmm, okay, she seems to be a little bit all over the map here. Let me think about a couple questions that I could ask that would help clarify, because there may be some information that I'm not noticing or not hearing that could be valuable to me instead of just stopping with, she seems all over the map. For a woman, seems way over focused on just some of these, some of these mathematical equations that he's sharing and not really looking at what the implications are for human beings in the real world. But it's interesting that he's able to focus on some things. And I'm realizing that I really actually missed some of what's going on with this initiative because I was more focused on what's happening around me. So let me try to put on my laser cap and really get a sense of what these numbers are and why they could be so important. So both of these are fairly sophisticated ways of rewriting a script that's based on an understanding that people's perceiving model can be different from our own. This is so important also with people of color and how it can affect. People of color tend to be have a much more active radar in noticing behavior from the dominant group than people in the dominant group do because they're just accustomed to thinking, yeah, this is how things are. Whereas people of color have a very active radar. So for a senior leader in a position to be able to solicit and build a relationship of trust with people so he can get that kind of information will always give him or her much more access to what's going on and a better understanding of how the culture is evolving and how it could be more successful.
Oh, that's a great antidote and a tool to use in building a more inclusive culture. The one thing that I hear a lot about with minorities, with everyone trying to build a more inclusive culture, that the most common statement I hear, it's not fair. And this is kind of a nonstop triggering machine for a lot of people. And I love the quote you put in the book by Peter Drucker. It's decisions are made by the person who has the power to make the decision, not necessarily the best person or the wisest person or the most qualified or insightful, but the person who has the power by virtue of his or her position. And I see that a lot. Do you see that a lot with the companies that you work with, that they just state this statement and that stops the inclusivity from really being fostered in that organization?
It does. It operates in two ways. First of all, it's hard to accept that the person who's in the position of power is actually the person who has the power to make a decision if we don't think they're the best person. We need to accept that. And I hear this is the source of a lot of it's not fair. It's not fair. This guy's a jerk. He made this decision. It was a bad decision. Okay, fine. It's not fair. Organizations aren't fair. Life isn't fair. Anybody who thinks this is a total meritocracy and people only rise because of their hard work is pretty dug in to a point of view that there are plenty of examples that could run counter to that. So it's not fair. Let's start from a place where we acknowledge that life isn't fair and that part of what we're trying to do in organizations is acquire more information so that we can create a fairer organization in order that people can realize their best talents. The largest possible percentage of people can realize their best talents. So that's the motivation for fairness. And then that's something we're working for. It's important for leaders to have that understanding. How could this be more fair? Is there something we're missing here? But not apologizing for being in the position to be able to make the decision. We're watching horrible decisions being made all the time and they're rarely fair. So it's important for us, for people in organizations to accept that and recognize that. And I think that was the point Drucker made so strongly. But it's also important for leaders to recognize we can't pretend that everything's fair for people. People have not had an equal shot, an equal chance. But it will be good for what we're trying to do to be able to listen to the largest number of people that we can, get their voices, and take that into consideration in the decisions that we make here even though it might not necessarily be the decision that they would prefer.
Well, you're right, and I also think it's important for the dominant group, whatever that may be in the culture and the society, to recognize that it's not fair. That even though they feel that it's fair, well, they need to acknowledge that for the minorities within that culture, that society, that they're likely having these feelings that it's not fair, and then they need to acknowledge it. Like you said, try to make sure that it's as inclusive as possible. That they reach out, that they get those a better understanding and ask those questions and try to really connect with them to hopefully bridge those divides whenever possible. We've covered about four of the triggers. We don't have time to cover them all, but I like to get into just a few of the tools that you list as well, because behaviors determine culture, because culture lives in the details of how we do things. And one of the great tools that you mentioned is just active listening. That can bridge a lot of the divide and build more inclusive cultures within any company.
Active listening is a skill that is very hard to practice. As we know, half the time when we're sitting in a meeting and somebody's talking or we're having a conversation with somebody, we're spending half of our brain capacity, if not most of it, thinking about what we're going to say next, how we're going to respond, what would be the best response. This is where managing perceptions also comes in as well. So, number one, when we listen, we want to be able to recognize we need to block out the noise as much as we can. It's almost listening can be almost a meditative practice where we're practicing being fully present to the person before us in this moment, which means being able to listen in a way that is engaged. So we're thinking, oh, well, one implication of what he's saying could be this, or I'm wondering if she's ever thought of that. But so we're active, we're involved, but we're not in a judging capacity and we're not formulating what our response is going to be. We're more likely in active listening to be asking questions. Now, two things I'd like to say. Number one is Peter Drucker, who you cited, was a very active listener. I was fortunate enough because I've been out there for a very long time to spend time with Peter Drucker. And he had a practice that in every meeting, he was the last person to speak. This took a lot of discipline and a lot of patience because what that meant is he was just sitting there often when, some certainly people who were in less exalted positions than he was were talking. And sometimes they were nervous and sometimes they went on too long. And sometimes what they were talking about was beside the point. It was his discipline to sit there and listen for things that could be useful to the group. And it was so impressive to me to see someone in that position always speak last. For some of us, it's very difficult to do that, but it's a really good practice. Another thing is that active listening does not involve constant affirmation. I think as listening has become more recognized as an important leadership skill, many of us, I'm going to include myself here, have fallen into the habit of when we're listening, oh, good idea. Yeah, I agree with that. Oh, that's fascinating. Constant running commentary on what the other person is thinking. I became aware of this in myself, for example, by listening to a tape of a conversation that I had led with a group of people. And I thought of myself, oh, I was really listening, I was learning a lot. It came across as constant interruption. This is amplified in our virtual environment because when we confirm, when we say, interesting, the camera in Zoom often defaults to us. So we really look as if we're hijacking the meeting. So let's not fall into thinking we're being an active listener because we're endlessly responding and commenting on what someone says. That's not the point. The point is internal attention and being able to formulate and thinking, how would I summarize this? That's how you really demonstrate active listening.
Now, how you listen matters, but who you listen to matters as well. So, one way to ensure that cross barrier communication is to regularly invite a range of people to participate in key meetings?
It's so important and it's often not done. I had a great demonstration of it decades ago when I sat into a meeting. Well, it was actually a phone interview with the New York Times over some controversial issue with Frances Hesselbein when she was leading the Girl Scouts. So she was having this big, high stakes phone call with the Times, and she invited the entire communication staff, including the most junior people in the organization who are in communications, just to be present in her office and listen. She was a very warm little conversation with them beforehand. And then she said, I want you to listen to how I handle this. I'm going to do my best. It may be remarkably successful. I may say some things that probably in retrospect were not the best things to say. I have to add, unlikely with Frances, but that's what she said. And she said, so just be thinking about, how might you handle a similar phone call? And then she went and she made the phone call, and people sat there, and it lasted about an hour. And after they left, I said, wow, that was really unusual. I don't think I've ever seen a senior leader doing something that's an important part of their job, but having a lot of junior people in the room. And she said, this is true. It's very rare. She said, but how are they going to ever learn how to do a job like I have? Well, if they don't see it done. So inviting people in and then structuring it. I have an example in the book that was a client I worked with, and they said, we're going to invite the junior team in to sit in on our monthly strategy meeting. Great idea. Okay. So they invited him in, and then they had the team that had this meeting all sitting around this big table, and all the junior people were bunched up behind. And the junior people didn't really, they were asked for comments, et cetera. People didn't really participate. And afterwards, they said, wow, that wasn't very successful. They don't seem very interested in what we're doing. Guess what? In order to say anything, they had to make their boss or some senior leader turn completely around in the seat. So they were reluctant to speak. So it can be even little things like seating arrangements, how you accommodate people, how you set it up, how you give them an idea of why you invited them and what your expectation would be. That's another thing they didn't do in that meeting. They didn't say, we are going to ask you at a couple points for your responses, for what you see here, what you're learning from watching this, and what you might add. So setting those expectations, being able to do that, really, really important.
And you're right, it's always more effective to model leadership behaviors than just to simply teach them, and that's such a critical piece of it. So, what would you say when people feel not valued? I tend to see it as where they believe that their contributions are ignored. They may even react by shutting down, and the most effective way to escape this trap, which may be totally contrary to what you want to do, is to make others feel good about themselves and really show gratitude. And one of our mutual friends, Chester Elton, he was on the podcast with me a few months ago. He advises us to be lavish with our appreciation, even in difficult circumstances. And he says, give praise now, give it often, and don't be afraid or hold back the praise.
Exactly. Chester, the apostle of appreciation, as he used to call himself, or the guru of gratitude. This is a wonderful practice because when we're feeling sorry for ourselves, when we're feeling excluded, when we're feeling out of it, when we're feeling out of our depth, when we're worried about how people might be perceiving us, or when we're feeling like, I'm not sure this is a fair situation and I'm getting a fair shake. The best thing we can do is to address what our mood is. We want to shift that mood. We want to shift that negative story that we're telling ourselves. And the best way we can do that is through the regular practice of gratitude. And guess what? We can always find something to be grateful for. I'm grateful to be in this meeting. I am grateful to be listening to this person. Maybe I'm not grateful to be listening to that person, but I'm grateful to be listening to this person. And then let people know, boy, what you said in that meeting was really helpful to me. A lot of times, junior people or people who aren't at an exalted level feel reluctant to share any praise with someone who's in a more senior position. Or if they do, they just do it in a very general way. I think you're wonderful. Well, that's great. But it's really helpful for that person to get some, what this point that you made was really, really helpful to me in thinking about how I'm going to do that job. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That is a really great way of rewriting our script, verbally rewiring ourselves, and feeling that glow that comes when we feel grateful.
Great stuff and great advice. And that's such a powerful way to really change that script in your head if you just operate under that the attitude of gratitude. The final thing that we'll probably have time for today, but I wanted just to kind of make sure that our listeners heard this as well, is why it's so important to enlist the help of others. That if you feel like your boss is not noticing you, that you really have to take it upon yourself in some cases to ask for endorsements. And once again, one of our mutual friends, Ruth Gottian, she was on the program last month. She says, that men are a little bit better at this than women because they make it easier to get these endorsements and they're not afraid to ask. So, what are some helpful tips that you could provide in helping the non dominant group to really enlist the help of others and to get endorsements that really speak to their skills and abilities?
Exactly. And I think that it can be challenging for people in the non dominant group because they often have the frame of mind of, well, this person is doing me a favor. And I have to ask this person to do me a favor. And I feel reluctant about that because it's kind of all one way. And I think one reason men tend to be better at this is being in the dominant group, they kind of don't look at it so much as a favor, but sometimes as an opportunity. I'm someone who's really going somewhere. So if I enlist you, if I enlist your support, if I ask you for an endorsement, if I ask you for a nomination, if I ask you for a favor in some way, you're very lucky that I asked you for a favor because I'm going places and then you'll have me as an ally going forward. And this is often a way that people from the non-dominant culture struggle to think. So I think putting that frame of mind in there, here's an opportunity, first of all, to make this person feel good. The number one people reason people help other people is because it makes them feel good about themselves. So why would you deprive them of an opportunity to feel good about themselves? So when you enlist someone as an ally, oh, could you, I think I'm having trouble breaking through in this situation and getting some recognition by Charles. If it works for you, if it's a comfortable situation, would you say something about the success that I had on X project and why you think that was so important to what we're doing? That would really be helpful to me. I'd so appreciate it. So, it can be framed in a kind of casual way like that. But it's really important to, when you make that kind of thing, think, this is an allyship. I'm asking this person for a favor. Doesn't mean it's a quid pro quo, but it also means that this person's going to feel more comfortable asking me for something. And after all, I have a lot to contribute. So it's good for them to know that they can call on me for similar help. You don't want to phrase it as a quid pro quo because if you do, then you take away the primary benefit to that other person, which is feeling great about themselves because they did something for someone else. So it's just a little shift in how you think, and that shift can influence your wording. So you're not going to go, oh, I know you're so busy, and I hate to ask you this. I mean, people do this all the time with endorsements. I know you're so busy. I hate to ask you this. If you could possibly, it's a lot of time wasting kind of language around this. And it doesn't give me the impression that this person is so much an ally as someone who's coming hat in hand for a favor. And approaching it in a more direct way says, okay, let's be allies. Let's help one another. Here's something that would be useful for me to ask you.
Is there a starting place for someone as they begin this process of trying to rise together, build more inclusive cultures? Is it the positive scripting? What would you recommend as maybe that first tool or technique that they start with?
I think identify one thing that they feel may trigger them and then think about ways that they might write a positive script. But I want to say one thing, Charles. Marshall Goldsmith, our colleague and friend, has wonderful research showing that the people who make sustainable positive behavioral change over time all have one thing in common: they don't try to do it alone. So, even something as simple as the script rewriting, we want to get in the habit of enlisting somebody, just saying, I've been struggling, feeling that this situation is unfair. I realize that what I'm assuming is going on here may not necessarily be what's going on here. I'm trying to rewrite in my own mind what's happening. How does this sound to you? Given the fact that you know me, given the fact that you know this other person who's triggering me, how does this sound to you? Do you think this would be effective? And then if the person says, yeah, but I think he's really actually this. No, no, I'm not trying to identify that. I want a script that will help me move forward. So it'll give me a positive interpretation. How does this work? Do you have any thoughts? Is there anything you could add? Telling people what you're doing rather than trying to do it alone is remarkably effective. It's one of the reasons that coaching, good coaching, works so well. We are forced to articulate what we're doing, why we're doing it to our coach, and then we get support and we get ideas based on that.
Spot on. You're absolutely correct that sustainable behavior change only happens when we enlist the help of others, whether that be a coach or others. It's not something you can do alone, and especially not something that's going to be sustainable in most cases if you try to do that alone. So, great stuff during this episode, Sally. Thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can connect with you and learn more about your work.
Oh, certainly. Best is the website, sallyhelgesen.com. I have a Substack newsletter that comes out every Wednesday morning. All Rise, it's called, and you can just Google me on Substack. And then, of course, LinkedIn and Twitter both.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.